She sat quietly in seat 14C, just another ordinary passenger nobody noticed. But when both engines died at 35,000 feet and the plane became a falling coffin, she stood up. The crew didn't know her secret. The passengers didn't recognize her face. Nobody knew the invisible woman could save them all, until she had to. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The morning sun slanted through the oval windows of Flight 447 as passengers shuffled down the narrow aisle, stuffing carry-ons into overhead compartments with the practiced inefficiency of people who fly just often enough to be confident but not often enough to be efficient. Sarah Chen settled into seat 14C, a middle seat that nobody ever wants, wedging her small backpack under the seat in front of her before pulling out a worn paperback thriller. She was 38 years old, dressed in jeans and a plain gray sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Nothing about her appearance suggested anything beyond the ordinary, another business traveler, perhaps, or maybe someone heading home after visiting family. The flight attendants barely glanced at her as they moved through their pre-flight routines, offering the same automatic smile they'd given 200 other passengers that morning. The man in 14B, a chatty sales manager named Kevin, initiated the kind of small talk that fills the awkward intimacy of sitting inches from strangers for hours. "Heading home or heading out?" he asked cheerfully, already settling into his role as the friendly seatmate. "Home," Sarah replied with a polite smile, the kind that's warm enough to be courteous but closed enough to discourage follow-up questions. It was a skill she'd perfected over the years, the art of being present without being memorable, of engaging without revealing, of existing in spaces without leaving any impression at all. "What do you do?" Kevin pressed, undeterred by subtle social cues. "Consulting," Sarah said, which was technically true in the loosest possible sense. She did occasionally consult, though not in the way Kevin would imagine. The vague answer satisfied him enough to launch into his own professional biography, which Sarah received with occasional nods while her eyes tracked the safety demonstration with an attention that would have seemed excessive if anyone had been watching. But nobody was watching. That was the point. The woman in 14A, elderly and nervous about flying, clutched the armrest as the engine spooled up for takeoff. Sarah reached over gently and patted her hand. "It's all perfectly normal," she said softly. "Those sounds are just the engines reaching full power. Nothing to worry about." The woman smiled gratefully, never knowing that the reassurance came from someone who understood those engine sounds at a level of technical precision that would have required 20 minutes to explain. Flight 447 lifted off from Chicago O'Hare at 10:47 a.m., bound for Seattle with 247 souls aboard. The Boeing 737-800 climbed steadily through scattered clouds, the Pratt & Whitney engines thrumming with their characteristic steady roar. Sarah felt the subtle shift in cabin pressure as they passed through 10,000 feet, the moment when the aircraft transitioned from the dense air of low altitude to the thinner atmosphere above. She'd felt this transition thousands of times, though usually from a very different seat. She opened her book but didn't really read it, her mind partly occupied with the background processing that never quite shut off, monitoring the engine sounds, tracking the aircraft's climb profile, noting the smooth competence of the pilots from the steadiness of the ascent. 16 years of military service had trained her to assess aircraft performance unconsciously, the way a musician might hear the subtle imperfections in an orchestra while civilians heard only pleasant music. But she kept these observations entirely to herself, buried beneath layers of deliberate ordinariness. Sarah Chen had been a fighter pilot. Not just any fighter pilot, but one of the best, an F-16 squadron leader with 2 combat deployments, an instructor pilot qualification, and a classified record of achievements that she'd never mentioned to anyone outside the military. She'd flown missions that remained redacted in official documents, had made split-second decisions at Mach 1.6 with surface-to-air missiles tracking her aircraft, had brought damaged fighters home through combinations of skill and sheer determination that had earned her quiet respect from fellow pilots and a chest full of medals she kept in a drawer at home. She'd left active duty 3 years ago, exhausted by the constant deployments, the relentless training cycles, the weight of command responsibility, and the isolation of being a woman in a field still dominated by masculine culture. She'd wanted normal. She'd wanted invisible. And she'd gotten it. In civilian life, nobody knew about the years of advanced training, the emergency procedures practiced until they became muscle memory, the countless hours in simulators running through scenarios where everything went wrong. Nobody knew because she never told them. She'd learned that revealing her military background changed how people saw her. Suddenly she became a curiosity, a token, something to be examined and questioned rather than simply accepted. So she'd chosen invisibility instead, blending into the anonymous masses of civilian life where nobody asked questions that required complicated answers. The flight attendants came through with their beverage cart, offering the usual selection of sodas and coffee. Sarah asked for water, exchanging the same pleasant nothingness of conversation that marked every transaction in modern air travel. The attendant, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and practiced efficiency, handed over the plastic cup without the slightest recognition that she was serving someone who could probably fly this aircraft better than the pilots in the cockpit. The invisibility was complete. Kevin from 14B was now asleep, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle that would guarantee neck pain when he woke. The elderly woman in 14A was reading a romance novel, occasionally glancing out the window at the carpet of clouds below. Sarah sipped her water and tried to focus on her book, but her mind kept wandering to the things she deliberately left behind, the adrenaline of high-performance flight, the razor-sharp focus required for combat operations, the camaraderie of squadron life, the sense of purpose that came from doing something that genuinely mattered. Consulting work paid the bills, but it didn't fill the hole that leaving the military had created. She traded significance for normalcy, and most days she told herself it was the right choice. The aircraft leveled off at 35,000 feet, entering that smooth cruising altitude where the Earth seems impossibly far below and the sky above stretches into darkness even in daylight. The cabin settled into the drowsy quiet of a mid-morning flight, passengers reading, working on laptops, watching movies on tiny screens, sleeping. The flight attendants retreated to their jump seats, their service duties temporarily complete. Everything was perfectly, routinely normal. Then, at 11:34 a.m., everything stopped being normal. Sarah felt it before she heard it, a subtle change in vibration that preceded the sudden, catastrophic silence. Both engines quit simultaneously, their steady roar cutting off so abruptly that the absence of sound seemed louder than the noise had been. The aircraft continued forward on momentum, but it was no longer powered flight, it was a glider, a 150,000-pound projectile with no thrust and nowhere to go but down. For perhaps 3 seconds, nobody else noticed. The sudden quiet could have been mistaken for noise-canceling headphones working too well, or ears adjusting to pressure changes. But Sarah knew. She knew with the instant, gut-level certainty of someone who'd spent thousands of hours in cockpits, who trained for exactly this scenario in simulators, who understood that what she was experiencing was impossible under normal circumstances. Commercial aircraft engines don't just quit. They especially don't quit simultaneously. And when they do, the situation is about as serious as aviation emergencies get. The captain's voice came over the intercom, and Sarah could hear the controlled professionalism that masked what must have been severe concern. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez. We've experienced a technical issue with both engines and are working to resolve it. Please remain calm and remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Around her, passengers stirred uneasily. Technical issue, both engines. The words penetrated slowly, their implications not yet fully grasped by people whose entire aviation experience consisted of occasional commercial flights. But Sarah understood instantly. She could hear it in the captain's voice, the careful word choices, the deliberate calm, the absence of specifics that would cause panic. He was trying to restart the engines. And it wasn't working. The aircraft began to descend. Not dramatically, not the nose-down plunge of disaster movies, but steadily, inexorably, following the physics of unpowered flight. From 35,000 feet, a modern commercial airliner could glide approximately 90 miles under ideal conditions. But without engines, there was no hydraulic power, no electrical generation beyond backup batteries, and extremely limited flight control authority. The pilots would be fighting the aircraft every second, trying to maintain optimal glide speed while searching desperately for anywhere flat enough to attempt an impossible landing. Kevin woke up, immediately sensing something wrong. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice carrying the edge of fear that hadn't yet become panic. "Engine trouble," Sarah said quietly, keeping her voice level. "The pilots are working on it." "Engine trouble, both engines?" "Yes." "Can planes fly with no engines?" "They can glide," Sarah said, which was true but unhelpful. She didn't mention that gliding from 35,000 feet gave them maybe 20 minutes before they had to be on the ground, and that finding somewhere safe to land an airliner in that timeframe was close to impossible. The elderly woman in 14A was gripping the armrests again, her knuckles white. "Are we going to crash?" she whispered. Sarah met her eyes and made a decision, a small one, but the first of many she'd make in the next few minutes. "The pilots are highly trained for emergencies," she said firmly. "They know what to do." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Commercial pilots were trained for single-engine failures, which were manageable. Dual-engine failure at altitude was such a rare event that it occupied only a small portion of training syllabi, usually discussed more theoretically than practically. Through the thin cabin walls, Sarah could hear the whine of the auxiliary power unit spinning up, providing emergency electrical power. Good, that meant the pilots still had flight instruments and some control authority. She counted silently, timing how long between restart attempts. The captain would be running through the engine restart checklist, trying different combinations of ignition and fuel flow, hoping that whatever caused the failure might be temporary or partial. But the engines remained silent. Whatever had gone wrong, it was catastrophic enough that standard restart procedures weren't working. Other passengers were beginning to notice now. The unnatural quiet, the continued descent, the way the flight attendants had stopped smiling and were speaking urgently into their intercom handsets. A child started crying somewhere toward the back of the cabin. A man across the aisle was frantically texting, trying to send messages before what? Before they ran out of time. Sarah pushed that thought away. The captain's voice returned, and this time the professional control had cracks in it. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are continuing to work on the engine issue. We are in contact with air traffic control and are being vectored toward the nearest suitable airport. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for possible emergency landing." Possible emergency landing. The euphemism was almost funny, in a dark way. They were definitely having an emergency landing, the only question was whether it would be at an airport or somewhere considerably less suitable. Sarah's mind automatically began calculating. 35,000 feet, descending at what felt like maybe 2,000 feet per minute based on the rate of pressure change in her ears. That gave them perhaps 15 minutes at current descent rate. Where were they? She tried to remember the route. They'd left Chicago heading northwest toward Seattle, so they were probably somewhere over Minnesota or Wisconsin. Lots of forests, lots of lakes, not many airports big enough for a 737. The woman in 14A was crying softly now. Kevin was staring straight ahead, his face pale. Throughout the cabin, the reality was sinking in. This wasn't routine, this wasn't a drill, this was the scenario that every nervous flyer imagines but never truly believes will happen. They were in an airplane with no engines, falling from the sky, and the pilot's repeated attempts to restart them had all failed. Sarah sat very still, her hands relaxed in her lap, her breathing controlled. She was conducting an internal assessment, weighing options, calculating possibilities. Her fighter pilot training had included extensive emergency procedures, engine failures at altitude, at speed, in combat conditions. She'd practiced single-engine landings dozens of times, had run through dual-engine failure scenarios in simulators. But those were military aircraft, smaller and more maneuverable than this lumbering commercial jet. Still, the principles were similar. Physics didn't change based on what type of aircraft you were flying. The question forming in her mind was simple but profound: should she reveal herself? For 3 years, she'd maintained her invisibility. She'd walked away from military life deliberately, chosen anonymity consciously, built a civilian existence that required nothing from her past. Getting involved now would shatter that carefully constructed normalcy. Everyone would know. She'd become the story, the curiosity, the former fighter pilot who saved the plane. She'd lose the peaceful obscurity she'd worked so hard to achieve. But 247 people were going to die if someone didn't do something. Sarah took a deep breath and unbuckled her seatbelt. The decision, once made, brought a clarity she hadn't felt in 3 years, a sense of purpose that civilian consulting work had never provided. She stood up, steadying herself against the seat back as the aircraft's descent created a slight angle to the cabin floor. "Miss, you need to remain seated," a flight attendant called out, rushing toward her. "I need to speak with the captain," Sarah said calmly. "That's not possible right now. Please return to your seat." "I'm a pilot," Sarah said, keeping her voice low enough that nearby passengers wouldn't hear but firm enough to convey absolute certainty. "Military. Fighter pilot. 16 years. I've trained for exactly this scenario, and I might be able to help." The flight attendant hesitated, clearly weighing procedures against unprecedented circumstances. "Ma'am, I—" "Tell them," Sarah interrupted, "that a former F-16 squadron leader wants to discuss engine restart procedures they probably haven't tried yet. Tell them I have experience with high-altitude dual-engine failures and tactical recovery operations. Tell them I'm offering assistance, not trying to interfere. And tell them quickly, because we're losing altitude." The flight attendant stared at her for a long moment, then nodded and hurried toward the cockpit. Sarah followed, moving up the aisle with practiced efficiency while around her passengers watched with expressions ranging from hope to confusion to suspicion. She could hear their whispered questions: "Who is she? Did she say she's a pilot? Is she going to fly the plane?" But she tuned them out, her mind already shifting into the tactical mode that had once been her default state. The cockpit door opened a crack, and the flight attendant spoke urgently to someone inside. Then the door opened wider, and Captain Rodriguez himself appeared, a man in his 50s with graying hair and eyes that held the particular kind of stress that comes from facing an unsolvable problem. He looked at Sarah with open skepticism. "You're a pilot?" he asked bluntly. "Yes, sir. Former Air Force F-16s Squadron Commander, 421st Fighter Squadron. Combat deployments to Afghanistan and Syria. Instructor pilot qualified. Separated 3 years ago at the rank of major." The words came out crisp, automatic, her military bearing reasserting itself after years of dormancy. "This is a commercial aircraft, not a fighter jet." "Yes, sir, I'm aware. But the principles of engine restart procedures are similar, and I've trained for dual-engine failures at altitude. Military training includes scenarios and techniques that commercial aviation doesn't typically cover. I'm not suggesting I take over, you're the captain and this is your aircraft. But I might know some things that could help." Rodriguez studied her face, conducting his own rapid assessment. Behind him, Sarah could see the cockpit, the first officer working frantically at the controls, the engine instruments all showing zero power, the altitude steadily unwinding. They were passing through 28,000 feet. Time was running out for conversation. "What's your theory about what happened?" Rodriguez asked, testing her. "Based on the simultaneous failure? Either fuel contamination, massive bird strike on both engines, or volcanic ash encounter. The last is unlikely given our route and current weather. Bird strike is possible but unusual for both engines unless we hit a large flock. Fuel contamination is most probable, possibly water in the fuel causing ice crystals to form at altitude and block the fuel lines. If that's the case, standard restart procedures won't work because you're just pumping contaminated fuel into the engines." Rodriguez's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's, actually our working theory. But if the fuel is contaminated, what the hell are we supposed to do about it?" "There are some procedures," Sarah said. "Military procedures, used in extreme situations. Can I come in?" Rodriguez made his decision. Get in here. Sarah stepped into the cockpit, and the door closed behind her. The space was cramped, filled with the electronic whine of backup systems and the tense silence of pilots fighting a losing battle. The first officer, a younger man named Patterson, glanced up at her with an expression that mixed hope and doubt. "This is Major Chen," Rodriguez said, which made Sarah blink. She hadn't used her rank in 3 years, and hearing it again felt like slipping into an old uniform that still fit perfectly. Apparently she's flown fighter jets and thinks she can help. I'm desperate enough to listen. What have you got? Sarah moved to the jump seat behind the captain's chair, her eyes rapidly scanning the instruments. Okay, you've tried standard restart procedures, ignition on, fuel flow established, starter engaged. Nothing. Nothing, Patterson confirmed. We're getting fuel flow indicators showing fuel is reaching the engines, but there's no ignition, no spool up. Dead as rocks. Right. If it's water contamination causing ice blockage, the fuel is flowing but it can't combust properly. Standard procedures assume the fuel itself is good. Military protocol for suspected contamination includes a thermal purge sequence. You use the auxiliary power unit's heat to warm the fuel lines and engine components, trying to melt any ice crystals, then attempt a hot start with increased ignition energy. The APU is already running for electrical power, Rodriguez said. How do we direct its heat to the fuel lines? You can't, directly. But you can use the aircraft's environmental control system. Redirect maximum heat to the engine nacelles through the anti-ice systems. Yes, that means temporarily reducing cabin heat, but we need to warm those fuel lines and combustion chambers. While that's happening, we prep for a modified start sequence. Patterson looked at Rodriguez. That's not in any manual I've ever seen. It's not in commercial manuals, Sarah said. But military aircraft sometimes operate in extreme conditions where fuel quality is suspect. The procedure is designed for field conditions where fuel might be contaminated with water or other substances. It doesn't always work, but it's better than nothing. Rodriguez was already making his decision. Patterson, redirect all anti-ice heat to maximum. I don't care if the cabin gets cold, we need those engines. Yes, sir. Patterson's hands moved across the controls, adjusting systems in ways they weren't typically adjusted. Anti-ice to maximum. Environmental control redirected. Nacelle heating engaged. Now we wait, Sarah said. Give it 90 seconds to warm the lines. While we wait, what's our altitude and descent rate? 26,000 feet, Rodriguez said, his eyes on the instruments. Descending at about 1,800 feet per minute. We're gliding okay, but control authority is limited without engine-driven hydraulics. You're doing well maintaining glide speed, Sarah said, and meant it. Keeping an unpowered aircraft stable while trying to restart engines and coordinate with air traffic control was no small feat. What's air traffic control giving you for landing options? They're vectoring us toward Minneapolis-St. Paul International. It's about 70 miles away, which is at the edge of our glide range. If we can't get the engines restarted, we might not make it. Sarah nodded, running calculations in her head. 70 miles from 26,000 feet was theoretically possible, but it would require perfect glide efficiency and no margin for error. What's the terrain between here and Minneapolis? Forested areas, some lakes, small towns. Nothing you'd want to try landing a 737 on. Then we need those engines running, Sarah said simply. 90 seconds is up. Let's try the modified restart sequence. First officer, set the fuel controls to manual override mode. Patterson hesitated, looking at Rodriguez. These weren't standard procedures, and following them meant trusting a stranger who'd appeared from the passenger cabin. But Rodriguez nodded, and Patterson complied. Manual override engaged. Good. Now, here's the critical part, we're going to attempt a high-energy ignition start. Normally you want smooth, gradual fuel introduction to prevent explosions or compressor stalls. But if we have ice blockages that are partially melted, we need a burst of extra energy to blow through any remaining contamination and establish combustion. It's risky, you can damage the engines, but damaged engines that run are better than pristine engines that don't. How do we do a high-energy start? Rodriguez asked. You dump extra fuel into the combustion chamber simultaneously with maximum ignition power. In a fighter, we have a specific switch for this. In a commercial aircraft, you have to do it manually by advancing the fuel flow control faster than normal while holding the ignition on continuous. Engine 1 first, if it works, we'll have power to analyze before trying engine 2. If it doesn't work, we haven't damaged both engines with the same failed procedure. Rodriguez took a breath. Okay. Let's try it. Patterson, when I give the word, advance engine 1 fuel flow control to 40%, then to full over a 3-second count. I'll hold continuous ignition. Ready? Ready, Patterson said, his voice tight. Major Chen, if this goes wrong. If it goes wrong, we're in exactly the same situation we're already in, Sarah said. But I've seen this procedure work. Trust the physics. Execute, Rodriguez said. Patterson's hand moved the fuel control lever. Sarah watched the engine instruments intently, looking for any sign of response. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then, a flicker on the exhaust gas temperature gauge. A tiny movement of the turbine speed indicator. The needle was rising, slowly, hesitantly, like an engine waking from death. Come on, Rodriguez muttered. Come on, baby. The engine speed indicator passed 20%, 30%. The whine of the turbine became audible even in the insulated cockpit. 40%, 50%. The engine was accelerating, air compressing, fuel combusting, the core temperature climbing into the normal range. We've got engine 1. Patterson shouted. Engine 1 is running. The transformation was immediate. Power surged back into the aircraft's hydraulic systems. Flight controls became responsive again. Electrical systems switched from backup to primary power. The descent rate began to decrease as one engine's thrust arrested their fall. Throughout the cabin, passengers felt the aircraft level slightly and heard the beautiful sound of an engine running, and for the first time in 10 terrifying minutes, hope replaced despair. Rodriguez allowed himself a brief smile. Outstanding. Okay, stabilizing at 23,000 feet. Major Chen, let's get engine 2 running. Same procedure, Sarah confirmed. The thermal purge worked on engine 1, so engine 2 should respond similarly. Ready when you are. They repeated the sequence. This time, Sarah noticed they were all holding their breath as Patterson advanced the fuel control. The second stretched out impossibly long. The engine instruments remained stubbornly lifeless. Sarah felt a cold finger of doubt. What if engine 2 had different damage? What if the blockage was more severe? What if? The exhaust gas temperature gauge jumped. The turbine began to spin. Engine 2 was coming back to life. Both engines running. Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying the profound relief of someone who'd been staring at catastrophe and just stepped back from the edge. He reached for the radio. Minneapolis Center, Delta 447, we have successfully restarted both engines. Engines are currently stable. Continuing approach to Minneapolis-St. Paul International. The radio crackled with the air traffic controller's voice, and Sarah could hear the amazement in it. Delta 447, Minneapolis Center, excellent news. We've been tracking your descent and honestly didn't think, well, congratulations to your crew. You're cleared direct to Minneapolis, descend and maintain 10,000 feet. Emergency equipment will be standing by. Roger, Minneapolis Center, cleared direct, descending to 10,000. And Center? The credit goes to a passenger who turned out to be a former fighter pilot. She knew procedures we'd never heard of. There was a pause on the radio, then, Delta 447, please tell your passenger that she just became a legend. We've got the whole facility watching your recovery. Nicely done, ma'am, whoever you are. Rodriguez turned in his seat to look at Sarah. He's right. You just saved 247 lives with knowledge that didn't exist in any manual I've ever seen. I don't know how to thank you. Sarah felt something unfamiliar, or rather, something she hadn't felt in 3 years. It was the feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, using skills that mattered in ways that couldn't be measured in consulting fees or annual reviews. It was purpose. It was meaning. It was the thing she'd given up when she'd chosen invisibility. Just doing what I was trained to do, sir, she said quietly. We're going to need you to stay up here for the landing, Rodriguez said. Those engines are running now, but they've been through a non-standard restart sequence and they're potentially damaged. If something goes wrong on approach, I want your expertise available. Of course, Sarah agreed. She settled into the jump seat, watching the instruments, monitoring the engine parameters. Both power plants were operating within normal ranges now, but she could see subtle fluctuations that suggested they weren't entirely happy, vibrations slightly higher than nominal, temperatures running a bit hot. The engines would need full inspections and probably major overhauls, but they were running, and running was enough. As they descended through 20,000 feet, Sarah could see the twin cities appearing on the horizon, the sprawl of urban development, the glint of lakes, the long runways of Minneapolis-St. Paul International growing clearer in the distance. The aircraft was flying normally now, all systems functioning, the crisis past. But the weight of what had just happened was beginning to settle on everyone in the cockpit. Can I ask you something, Major? Patterson said, not taking his eyes off his instruments. You can ask. And it's just Sarah now. I separated 3 years ago. Why were you sitting back in coach? I mean, you clearly have piloting credentials. You could have been up here as a jump seat rider if you'd identified yourself. Sarah considered the question. Because I didn't want to be identified. I left the military specifically to stop being a fighter pilot, to stop being defined by what I used to do. I wanted to just be a normal person living a normal life. So I kept my background private. But you just revealed it to save us, Rodriguez said. You gave up your privacy, your anonymity, to help people you didn't even know. Yes, Sarah said simply. Because what else could she say? That she'd spent 3 years trying to forget she'd ever been a warrior, only to discover that some things can't be forgotten. That skills earned through years of training in combat don't just disappear because you want a quieter life. That sometimes the person you used to be is still the person you are, no matter how hard you try to be someone else. The aircraft intercepted the instrument landing system for runway 30L. Rodriguez flew the approach with steady precision, his confidence restored by having engines that actually worked. Sarah watched in silence, her presence now superfluous but still appreciated. They crossed the threshold at exactly the right height and speed, the wheels chirping on the runway with a smoothness that seemed almost anticlimactic after the drama of the previous half hour. Emergency vehicles paced them down the runway, fire trucks, ambulances, emergency response teams prepared for anything. But the landing was completely normal, and the aircraft rolled to a safe stop on a taxiway, where it would be met by maintenance crews and investigators. Rodriguez set the parking brake and began the engine shutdown sequence, finally allowing himself to exhale fully. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez. We have landed safely in Minneapolis. I want to thank you for your patience during what was obviously a very difficult situation. We will be met by emergency personnel as a precaution, but everyone is safe. I also want to acknowledge a passenger who provided crucial assistance during our emergency, a former Air Force fighter pilot who knew procedures that quite literally saved this aircraft and everyone on it. I wish I could thank her publicly, but I suspect she prefers her privacy. Nonetheless, on behalf of the entire crew and all your fellow passengers, ma'am, you have our eternal gratitude. Sarah felt her eyes sting slightly. The announcement was simultaneously everything she'd wanted to avoid and everything she'd needed to hear. She'd saved them. Her training, her expertise, her years of service that she tried to dismiss as a past life, all of it had mattered. All of it had been necessary. All of it had been real and valuable and worth the sacrifice of her carefully constructed anonymity. "You'll need to debrief with the NTSB," Rodriguez said, unstrapping from his seat. "This event will be investigated thoroughly. Dual-engine failures are extremely rare, and the restart procedures you used aren't documented in commercial aviation. They'll want to interview you extensively." "I understand," Sarah said. "I'll provide whatever information they need. Before that happens, though, I want to say something personal." Rodriguez turned to face her directly. "I've been flying commercially for 28 years. I've had training in every emergency scenario you can imagine. I've practiced in simulators, studied manuals, attended recurrent training sessions year after year. And when I actually faced a real dual-engine failure, everything I knew was useless. The procedures didn't work. The training wasn't enough. I was going to have to tell 247 people to prepare for impact, to kiss their loved ones goodbye, to write their last texts. And then you appeared, with knowledge I didn't even know existed, and you saved us all. So thank you. Thank you for being on this flight. Thank you for revealing yourself despite clearly wanting to remain anonymous. Thank you for being willing to help even though it cost you something valuable." Sarah swallowed hard. "You're welcome, Captain. And for what it's worth, you handled an impossible situation with remarkable professionalism. You kept the aircraft stable, maintained communication with ATC, and were willing to listen to unconventional suggestions from a stranger. A lot of captains wouldn't have opened that cockpit door. A lot of captains would have killed everyone aboard by being too proud to accept help," Rodriguez said bluntly. "I'm just glad I'm not that stupid." They shared a brief smile, the kind of connection that forms between people who faced death together and survived. Then the cockpit door opened, and a flight attendant appeared, her expression a mixture of relief and agitation. "Captain, the passengers are asking about the woman who helped. They want to thank her. There's quite a crowd gathering in the aisle." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. This was the part she'd been dreading, the attention, the questions, the transformation from anonymous passenger to public figure. In the military, heroism was documented but not celebrated publicly. You did your job, received your commendation, and moved on. But in civilian life, especially after an event this dramatic, there would be media coverage, interviews, articles. Her face would be on news websites. Her story would be told and retold. The invisibility she'd cultivated for 3 years would be completely obliterated. "Tell them I'll come out in a few minutes," Sarah said. "Let me collect myself first." The flight attendant nodded and withdrew. Sarah stood in the cramped cockpit, looking out at the airport ramp where ground crews were approaching the aircraft. She thought about the life she'd built, the quiet consulting work, the anonymous apartment, the weekends spent hiking alone, the careful construction of a personality that revealed nothing important. She'd thought she wanted that. She'd thought invisibility was freedom. But standing here, having just used skills earned through years of sacrifice and training, having just saved lives that would have been lost without her intervention, she realized something fundamental: she hadn't been free. She'd been hiding. She'd been pretending that her past didn't matter, that her training was irrelevant, that the warrior she'd been wasn't the person she still was. And that pretense had been its own kind of prison. "Major Chen?" Patterson said tentatively. "Sarah? Are you okay?" She turned to face him, and for the first time in 3 years, she answered honestly. "I don't know. I thought I left this behind. I thought I was done being a pilot, done being defined by military service, done being the person who has to step up in emergencies. I wanted to just be normal." "Normal people don't save aircraft full of passengers," Rodriguez said gently. "Normal people don't have the training or the knowledge or the courage to walk into a cockpit during a crisis and implement procedures that don't exist in any civilian manual. You're extraordinary. You've always been extraordinary. And maybe trying to be anything else was never going to work. Sarah absorbed his words, feeling their truth resonate with something deep inside her. She'd been a fighter pilot. She'd been a squadron commander. She'd been a warrior. And trying to simply stop being those things hadn't worked because they weren't just jobs, they were fundamental parts of her identity. The skills, the mindset, the readiness to act in crisis, these weren't things you could take off like a uniform. They were woven into who she was. "What are you going to do now?" Patterson asked. "After all this?" "Right now, I'm going to face those passengers," Sarah said, making another decision. "They deserve to know who helped them and why. And after that? I don't know. Maybe I need to figure out how to integrate who I was with who I want to be, instead of pretending they're different people." She moved to the cockpit door, paused, then turned back. "Captain Rodriguez? Thank you for opening that door. Thank you for being willing to trust a stranger who claimed to have answers. It takes a special kind of wisdom to accept help when it comes from unexpected sources." "Thank you for being someone worth trusting," Rodriguez replied. "Blue skies, Major." "Blue skies," Sarah echoed, the traditional aviator's farewell feeling both foreign and familiar on her lips. She opened the door and stepped into the cabin. The change from the cockpit's focused intensity to the cabin's emotional chaos was jarring. Passengers were standing, crying, hugging each other, talking excitedly. When she emerged, a wave of recognition rippled through the crowd. These were the people she'd sat among anonymously for the first hour of the flight: the sales manager Kevin, the elderly nervous woman, the young mother with 2 children, the business travelers, the families, the complete strangers who'd shared the possibility of death together. They began to clap. It started with a few people and spread rapidly, building into sustained applause that filled the entire cabin. Sarah felt her face flush, uncomfortable with the attention but unable to deny that it moved her. These weren't fellow pilots acknowledging a job well done. These were people who understood that they'd come within minutes of death and had been given their lives back. Kevin from 14B pushed through the crowd, his eyes red from crying. "You," he said, his voice breaking. "You were sitting right next to me. I told you about my sales territory and my daughter's soccer games and you just listened like a regular person, and the whole time you were. I was just another passenger," Sarah said gently. "Until suddenly I needed to be something else." The elderly woman from 14A gripped Sarah's hand with surprising strength. "You told me the engine sounds were normal. You were so calm. Did you know even then?" "I didn't know there would be an emergency," Sarah admitted. "But I knew what normal sounded like, and I knew you were safe at that moment. That's all I could honestly tell you then." A flight attendant approached, one of the younger ones who'd served drinks earlier without the slightest recognition of anything unusual about Sarah. "Ma'am, I have to ask, why didn't you identify yourself at boarding? If we'd known we had a military pilot on board, we would have offered you jump seat privileges in the cockpit." "Because I didn't want jump seat privileges," Sarah said. "I wanted to be a regular passenger. I've spent the last 3 years trying to be just another person living a normal life, not defined by what I used to do professionally." "But you're a hero," the flight attendant insisted. "You saved all of us." Sarah shook her head. "I'm not a hero. I just have specialized training that happened to be relevant to this particular emergency. If we'd had a medical emergency, I'd have been useless and we'd have needed a doctor to step forward. If we'd had a fire, we'd have needed firefighting expertise. I was just the right person with the right skills at the right moment. That's not heroism, that's luck combined with training." But even as she said it, Sarah knew it wasn't entirely true. Because the hard part hadn't been having the skills, it had been choosing to reveal them. It had been deciding that saving lives mattered more than maintaining her anonymity. It had been accepting that the person she'd been trying not to be was exactly the person everyone needed her to be. A young girl, maybe 8 years old, tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "Miss? Were you really a fighter pilot? Like in the movies?" Sarah knelt down to the girl's eye level. "Yes, I was. Though it's not quite like the movies. It's a lot more training and studying and practicing than exciting aerial combat. Did you fly in wars? The girl asked with the directness only children possess. Yes, I did. Were you scared? Sarah considered the question seriously. Sometimes, yes. Being scared is normal. The important thing is not letting fear stop you from doing what needs to be done. Today I was scared too, scared I might not remember the right procedures, scared my suggestions might not work, scared I might make things worse instead of better. But I tried anyway, because not trying guaranteed that things would end badly. The girl nodded solemnly, processing this adult wisdom. I want to be a pilot when I grow up. Then study hard, especially math and science, Sarah said. And don't let anyone tell you that you can't do it because you're a girl. I've flown fighter jets that break the sound barrier, and so can you if you're willing to work for it. The girl's mother appeared, pulling her daughter back with an apologetic smile, but Sarah could see the gratitude in the woman's eyes, gratitude not just for saving their lives, but for giving her daughter a living example that women could do extraordinary things. The crowd of passengers gradually dispersed as airport personnel began organizing the deplaning process. Sarah returned to her seat to collect her backpack, and Kevin appeared beside her, his characteristic chattiness subdued into something more genuine. When I asked what you did and you said consulting, I assumed you meant, like, business consulting. PowerPoint presentations and quarterly projections. I do actually do some consulting, Sarah said. Aviation safety consulting for a defense contractor. Helping them understand how military emergency procedures might be adapted for civilian applications. She paused, realizing something. Or at least, I did. I suspect after today, my job description might change significantly. Are you upset about that? About everyone knowing now? Sarah considered the question as she pulled her backpack from under the seat. Was she upset? Her carefully maintained anonymity was certainly destroyed. This event would be investigated, documented, reported. Her name would be in NTSB reports. News organizations would want interviews. Her former squadron mates would hear about it and contact her. The invisible life she'd constructed was definitively over. No, she said finally, surprising herself with the honesty of it. I thought I would be, but I'm not. I've spent 3 years trying to be someone I'm not, trying to pretend that 16 years of military service and fighter pilot training was just a phase I went through rather than a fundamental part of who I am. Today reminded me that you can't just decide to stop being the person you've trained yourself to be. The skills are permanent. The instincts are permanent. The responsibility to use them when needed, that's permanent too. So what now? Kevin asked. Now I stop trying to hide from myself, Sarah said. I figure out how to integrate my military background with my civilian life instead of treating them as incompatible. Maybe I actually use my expertise professionally instead of keeping it secret. Maybe I stop being afraid that being good at something makes me less human. They joined the line of passengers slowly moving toward the exit. When Sarah reached the cockpit door, Rodriguez and Patterson were standing there, having completed their post-flight duties. Rodriguez extended his hand. The NTSB will want to interview you within the next 48 hours, he said. I've given them your seat assignment, and the airline has your booking information. They'll contact you. I'll make myself available, Sarah confirmed. There's something else, Rodriguez continued. The airline's chief pilot wants to talk to you about possibly joining their emergency procedures training program. Apparently, what you knew today isn't taught in commercial aviation, and they think it should be. They want your expertise to help develop new training protocols. Sarah felt something shift inside her, an alignment of purpose she hadn't experienced since leaving the military. I'd be interested in discussing that. I thought you might be, Rodriguez said with a knowing smile. Turns out you can't really stop being a pilot any more than you can stop breathing. It's who you are. Sarah stepped off the aircraft into the jetway, where airline officials and airport security were waiting to escort her through the post-emergency procedures. Behind her, the passengers she'd saved were sharing their stories, calling loved ones, posting on social media about the extraordinary woman who'd appeared from nowhere to save them all. Ahead of her lay debriefings, investigations, interviews, and the complete loss of the anonymity she'd spent 3 years cultivating. But for the first time since separating from the Air Force, Sarah felt something that had been missing, a sense of rightness, of being exactly who she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. She'd thought leaving the military meant leaving behind the identity of warrior, protector, expert. She'd thought civilian life required her to be diminished, to hide her capabilities, to pretend extraordinary skills were ordinary limitations. She'd been wrong. The woman who'd sat in seat 14C reading a magazine had been just as real as the fighter pilot who'd saved Flight 447. They weren't separate people, they were the same person at different moments, using different skills. The challenge wasn't choosing between them. It was accepting that she could be both, that she could live a civilian life while still honoring the training and expertise that made her exceptional. As she walked through the terminal, Sarah pulled out her phone and opened her contacts. She scrolled to a number she hadn't called in 3 years, her former squadron commander, the woman who'd mentored her through her transition to fighter pilot, who'd written her recommendation for squadron command, who'd understood when Sarah said she needed to leave active duty. The phone rang twice before connecting. Sarah Chen, the familiar voice said with evident surprise and pleasure. I heard through the grapevine that you just saved a commercial airliner using procedures that didn't exist in any civilian manual. Want to tell me what happened? Colonel Martinez, Sarah said, and felt herself smiling for the first time in hours. I'm calling because I think I've been approaching civilian life all wrong. I tried to stop being a fighter pilot, but today I learned that's not actually possible. So I'm wondering if you know anyone who might be interested in hiring someone with extensive military aviation expertise who's finally ready to stop hiding it. As a matter of fact, Martinez said, the Air National Guard has been trying to reach you for 2 years about an instructor position. They need experienced fighter pilots to train the next generation. The pay isn't spectacular, but the mission is important and the schedule allows for civilian employment on the side. Interested? Sarah stopped walking, passengers flowing around her in the busy terminal. She thought about the last 3 years of deliberate invisibility, of consulting work that paid well but meant little, of weekends spent alone rather than in the squadron camaraderie she'd missed. She thought about the young girl on the aircraft who wanted to be a pilot, and how much it would have meant to her younger self to have a female instructor pilot showing her the way. Yes, she said simply. I'm interested. I'm very interested. Outstanding, Martinez said. I'll make some calls. But Sarah? Welcome back. We missed you. I missed this too, Sarah admitted. More than I was willing to admit. She ended the call and continued through the terminal, no longer trying to blend into the crowd, no longer trying to be invisible. Because the truth was, some people aren't meant to be invisible. Some people have skills and training and expertise that make them extraordinary, and hiding that doesn't make them normal, it just makes them invisible. And invisible doesn't serve anyone. The news was already breaking on airport televisions, reports of the miraculous dual-engine failure recovery, speculation about the mysterious passenger who'd assisted, early interviews with air traffic controllers describing the impossible successful restart. Sarah's face wasn't shown yet, but it would be soon. Her anonymity had perhaps hours remaining. And for the first time in 3 years, she was okay with that. Because today, 247 people went home to their families because she'd been willing to step forward and reveal who she really was. 247 people got to hug their children, see another sunrise, continue their lives because she'd stopped hiding her extraordinary capabilities behind a facade of ordinariness. That mattered more than anonymity. That mattered more than comfort. That was worth everything. Sarah Chen, former fighter pilot, decorated combat veteran, squadron commander, an anonymous passenger in seat 14C, walked out of Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport into brilliant afternoon sunshine. She pulled out her phone again and texted her consulting firm, giving notice that she'd be transitioning to different work. Then she booked a hotel room, knowing she'd be in Minneapolis for several days of investigations and debriefings. Finally, she sat on a bench outside the terminal and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened, the terror of those passengers, the impossible emergency, the desperate implementation of procedures that shouldn't have worked but did, the revelation of skills she'd kept hidden, the sacrifice of anonymity for survival. And underneath all of it, deeper than fear or relief or exhaustion, she felt something profound and true. She felt like herself again. Not the diminished, hidden version she'd been trying to be. Her complete self, warrior and woman, fighter pilot and human being, extraordinary and ordinary all at once. A young reporter approached cautiously, apparently having recognized her from the rapidly circulating descriptions. "Excuse me, are you the woman who helped save Flight 447? Sarah looked up at the reporter, at the camera operator behind him, at the immediate future of interviews and questions and loss of privacy. 3 years ago, she would have deflected, denied, hidden. But 3 years ago, she'd been trying to be someone she wasn't. "Yes," she said clearly. "I'm Major Sarah Chen, former Air Force fighter pilot. And I'm happy to answer your questions, because if my experience today can help improve aviation safety and inspire others to value their expertise instead of hiding it, then the publicity is worth it." The reporter's eyes lit up with the professional excitement of someone who knows they're getting a good story. "Can you tell us what happened up there?" And Sarah began to talk, no longer hiding behind vague consulting descriptions or deliberate anonymity, but speaking clearly about military training and emergency procedures and the moment when she decided that saving lives mattered more than maintaining invisibility. The sun was warm on her face. The sky above was clear and blue, pilot weather, they called it in the Air Force. The kind of sky that makes you want to fly. And for the first time in 3 years, Sarah felt that desire again, not as a guilty remnant of a past she was trying to escape, but as a fundamental part of who she was and would always be. She was a fighter pilot. She was a warrior. She was extraordinary. And she was done apologizing for it. The interview continued, but Sarah's mind was already moving forward, to the National Guard position, to developing new training protocols, to the life she could build that honored both her military expertise and her civilian needs. She'd thought these were incompatible. She'd thought choosing civilian life meant abandoning military identity. She'd been wrong, and today had proven it. The most qualified experts often travel unnoticed. The most capable people frequently hide their skills behind ordinary appearances. But sometimes, in moments of crisis, the mask slips and the truth emerges, not just the truth of what someone can do, but the truth of who they fundamentally are. Sarah Chen was a fighter pilot who'd saved 247 lives by remembering that training isn't something you leave behind, it's something you carry forward, ready to deploy the moment it's needed. And now, finally, she understood that truth wasn't a burden to hide. It was a gift to share.